Nobody introduced them. That was the first thing, the absence of the usual machinery of meeting, the handshake and the name and the establishing of context that normally organized an encounter between two people in a backstage space. There was no introduction because there was no one to make one, because they arrived at the same folding chair area at the same moment from different directions, and the arrival was simply the arrival, without apparatus. The woman was already sitting when Janice came around the corner of the equipment tent, 20 minutes before her set, in the particular pre-show state that people who worked with her had learned to read accurately. Not nervous, she was rarely nervous in the conventional sense, had long since moved past the specific anxiety of the new performer and into a different kind of pre-performance condition that was more like gathering than apprehension. She was concentrated. She was collecting something from wherever it was kept between performances, bringing it to the surface, making it available for what the next 2 hours would require. She came around the corner and the woman was there. She was old. This was the immediate impression, old in the specific way of people who have lived hard and long and have the specific gravity that the combination produces, not frail, not diminished. Old in the way that certain trees are old, heavier than they were, more deeply rooted, carrying more rings inside than you could count from the outside. She was sitting in one of the folding chairs with her hands in her lap and her eyes directed toward the festival stage, which was visible from where they were, the setup crew still working, the sound check for the previous act fading, the particular organized chaos of a large outdoor music event at the point where several things are happening simultaneously and each of them is urgent. She was wearing a dress the color of good soil. She had a cloth bag on the ground beside her chair. Her hands in her lap were the hands of someone who had been using them for a long time for purposes that left a record. Janice stood at the edge of the folding chair area for a moment. She had meant to sit. She did this before performances sometimes, found a quiet corner and sat with herself for a few minutes before the gathering became final. The folding chair area was the quiet corner she had found. She had not expected anyone to be in it. She sat down anyway, in the chair beside the woman, 2 chairs apart with an empty chair between them, which was the natural distance for two people who did not know each other in a space with enough chairs. The woman did not look at her. This was not rudeness. It was simply the behavior of someone whose attention was directed elsewhere, at the stage, at the festival, at something in the middle distance that Janice could not identify. Her expression was the expression of someone watching something they have seen many versions of and are watching with the accumulated perspective of all the previous versions. Janice did not introduce herself. She was not sure why. The normal social mechanics would have produced an introduction. She was, by July 1969, someone whose name produced a specific response when said to almost anyone under 40 in America, and the backstage of the Newport Folk Festival was not a place where that response was unavailable. She could have said her name and the woman would very likely have known it, and the machinery of recognition would have started and they would have had the conversation that the machinery produced. She did not say her name. She sat in the chair 2 seats away from the woman and looked at the stage. The setup crew was working. Someone was adjusting a monitor. The sound was running a low tone through the system as a test, a note that was not quite music but was in the vicinity of music, the sound of an instrument being asked if it was ready. The July afternoon light was at the angle that late afternoon takes at an outdoor festival, coming from the west across the festival grounds, catching the dust that the crowd raised and the smoke from the food vendors and the particular visible quality of sound-carrying air at a large outdoor event. She looked at this. The woman looked at this. They sat. There are things that pass between people who are not speaking that cannot be reproduced in language because the language would make them into something they were not, would give them a shape and a definition that they did not have in the moment of their passing, that they specifically did not have. The thing that passed between Janis Joplin and the woman in the folding chair in the July afternoon at Newport was this kind of thing, not information, not the specific transmission of content that words carry. Something else, the specific quality of being in the same space as someone who has been where you are trying to go, who carries the evidence of the going in the specific weight of their presence, in the particular quality of how they hold themselves, in the accumulated texture of having done the thing over and over across more time than you have yet had. Janis did not know who the woman was. She would not know for some time. The story of the encounter, told later to the journalist who kept it off the record, did not include a name, and the journalist's account preserved this. She never said who the woman was. The woman was the woman, defined by the specific quality of the encounter rather than by any external credential. But Janice understood, in the way that musicians understand certain things about other musicians without requiring the documentation, something about where the woman had come from, the hands in the lap, the dress the color of soil, the way she looked at the stage with the perspective of someone for whom stages were not exceptional things but simply the ordinary venue of a life's work, familiar, necessary, neither glamorous nor unglamorous. She had been doing this a long time, longer than Janice. Longer than almost anyone at Newport, which was a festival whose population skewed young in the way that the folk revival had skewed young, which was a festival whose relationship to the tradition was in many cases the relationship of the scholar to the subject rather than the practitioner to the practice. This woman was not a scholar, she was the practice. Janice felt this without being able to name it. She felt it in the way that you feel certain things that are true before you have the language for the truth, in the chest, in the posture of the body, in the specific quality of attention that the proximity of something real produces. She did not say anything. The woman did not say anything. They sat in the folding chairs in the July afternoon, 2 seats apart, and looked at the stage, and the sound crew worked, and the festival continued its organized chaos around them, and the silence between. The 2 chairs was not the silence of discomfort or the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the other silence. The silence that is its own form of communication, not the absence of speech, but the presence of something that speech would diminish by making it smaller than it was. Janice thought about Bessie Smith. She had been thinking about Bessie Smith since she was 17 years old, had thought about her in Port Arthur and in Austin and in San Francisco, and in every city the tour took her to, had thought about her in the way you think about someone who gave you a language before you knew you needed one. Bessie Smith had died in 1937, before Janice was born, which meant that the thinking had always been the thinking of someone reaching backward through time toward something they could not directly touch. The records were there, the recordings existed, but the person who had stood on stages and opened herself completely to the music and given it directly to whoever was in the room, that person was available only through the recordings, and recordings, however extraordinary, were not the same as presence. The woman in the folding chair had presence. The specific, substantial, irreducible presence of someone who had been doing something for a long time that was not incidental to their life, but was their life, who had organized their years around the practice of a thing and had the specific weight that practice, sustained over decades, produces. Janice did not know if the woman sang, she assumed it. The assumption was not based on anything specific, but on the quality of how the woman looked at the stage, the familiar look, the practitioner's look. She thought she might have known Bessie Smith. It was a simple thought, it was possibly not accurate, but the chronology was possible, the woman was old enough, the geography was possible, the world of the blues tradition was small enough. She might have known her, might have heard her, might have shared a bill with her in some city in some decade that predated everything Janice knew about as anything other than history. She was sitting 2 seats away from someone who might have known Bessie Smith. She did not ask. This was deliberate. She understood in the way that the moment seemed to ask her to understand it, that asking would end something. The asking would require an answer, and the answer would produce a conversation, and the conversation would produce the ordinary texture of 2 people exchanging information, and what was in the space between the 2 chairs was not the ordinary texture of 2 people exchanging information. It was something that the silence was preserving by being silence. She let it be silence. Newport in July 1969 was a festival in the middle of its particular cultural moment, a moment that was, as all cultural moments eventually are, both the thing and the awareness that the thing was passing. The folk revival had produced something real and was beginning to produce the nostalgia for the real thing that signals the approach of the end. The audiences were large and devoted. The performers had something genuine to give, but the festival was also a place where the living tradition and the scholarly interest in the tradition occupied the same grounds, and the distinction between them was not always clear. Janice was not a folk artist in the strict categorical sense. She was on the bill because the categories had been loosening since the early 60s, because the folk tradition and the blues tradition and the rock tradition were understood to be branches of the same tree by enough of the people in charge of the booking to make the booking possible. She was also there because the blues tradition that ran underneath everything she had been doing since she was 17 had its deepest roots in exactly the kind of music that Newport honored: the Bessie Smith records, the Lightbelly records. The tradition that had given her a language when she had not known the language existed. She was there because she was, in a direct and unambiguous way, the daughter of that tradition, absorbed through a record player in a Port Arthur bedroom at 17, transmitted through the specific frequency of the music into the specific frequency of what she was. The woman in the folding chair was not a tributary of the tradition. She was possibly, in Janice's feeling of it, the tradition itself, or something very close to the source of it. The place where the music had come from before it had been recorded and distributed and absorbed by a white girl from Texas who had found in it the only language adequate to what she felt. The woman stood up after approximately 15 minutes. She did not look at Janice when she stood. She picked up the cloth bag from beside her chair and settled it on her arm with the practiced economy of someone who has been picking up bags for many decades, and she straightened, and she walked in the direction she walked, which was away from the stage and toward the festival grounds. She did not look back. She did not say goodbye because they had not said hello, because the meeting had not been that kind of meeting, and the ending was not that kind of ending. She simply stood and walked with the particular unhurried movement of someone who has somewhere to be and has been going somewhere all her life and is going there now. Janice watched her go. She watched until the woman had disappeared into the organized chaos of the festival, the crowd, the tents, the movement of hundreds of people doing hundreds of things simultaneously. And then the woman was gone, absorbed into the afternoon, and Janice was alone in the folding chair area with 2 chairs and an empty chair between them and 10 minutes until her set. She sat for a moment. She thought about the 15 minutes, about what had passed in them, which was nothing that could be named and nothing that could be recorded, and nothing that would appear in any account of the Newport Folk Festival of July 1969. A woman had sat in a folding chair, another woman had sat 2 chairs away. They had not spoken. The first woman had stood up and left. That was, from the outside, the whole of it. From the inside, it was something that Janice would carry with her for the rest of her life, or for the 15 months she had remaining of it, which was what the rest of her life turned out to be. She would not describe it accurately. The attempt she made months later to the journalist who kept it off the record was honest and insufficient simultaneously. She said, "I sat next to an old woman before my set and she didn't say anything and I didn't say anything and something passed between us that I didn't understand then and don't entirely understand now." She said, "It felt like being given permission." She said, "Permission for what? I don't know, just permission." The journalist wrote it down and put it in a drawer and did not take it out for many years. What Janice meant, to the extent that what she meant can be extracted from the insufficient description, was something like this: there are things you learn from instruction and things you learn from proximity. The instruction is the information, the technique, the history, the specific knowledge that can be transmitted in language and received in language and applied through practice. The proximity is the other thing. The thing that passes between people who are doing the same work at different stages of the doing it, that does not require language because language is not its vehicle. The thing that the silence in the folding chair area had carried between the 2 chairs across the empty chair between them. She had been doing the work for years. She had learned from records and from performing and from the accumulated experience of opening herself completely to the music and giving it what it required and receiving from audiences what they gave back. She had learned from Bessie Smith and from Big Mama Thornton and from the blues tradition that had been her first language and remained her deepest one. She had learned from Nick Gravenites and from Big Brother and from the Cosmic Blues Band and from Paul Rothchild and from every session and every show and every night in every city that had been part of the education. She had not learned from proximity to the source itself. She had not sat 2 chairs away from someone who carried, in the specific weight of their presence, the living memory of the tradition that had made her, who had been doing this work, possibly, before Janice was born, who had been opening themselves to the music and giving it what it required, and receiving what audiences gave back in rooms and venues and outdoor festivals and places that the history books had not preserved for longer than Janice had been alive. The 15 minutes in the folding chairs had given her that proximity, not the knowledge, not the instruction, the other thing. The thing that proximity to the source of a tradition provides to someone who has come from the tradition's edges, a specific confirmation, felt rather than stated, that the line runs through, that the current is real, that the work she had been doing for years was connected to the work the old woman had been doing for decades, that the tradition was alive in her in the specific way it had been alive in the woman, and that the living of it was what the work required. Permission, she had said. Permission to believe that the line was real, that she was in it, that the voice she was about to walk onto the Newport stage and use was not an aberration or an accident or a particular personal quality disconnected from anything larger than itself, but a continuation, a living extension of something that had been going on for a long time and would go on after her. The Newport set that night has been described by people who were there as among the best performances of her career, not the loudest, not the most technically overwhelming. Something more specific, the performances where the technique and the feeling had achieved an alignment that produced a quality of simplicity on the far side of complexity, the quality that the best performances of any art form have. The sense that what is happening is completely inevitable, that it could not have been otherwise, that every element has arrived at exactly the place it was supposed to arrive. People who had seen her perform many times described this set as different. The word they used most often was settled, not less intense. The intensity was fully present, settled within the intensity, the specific quality of someone who has found the ground under their feet and is performing from it rather than searching for it. She had found the ground in the folding chairs, not in any mystical sense. In the specific, practical sense of having been placed, accidentally and briefly, in the proximity of someone who had been standing on that ground for longer than Janice had known the ground existed, and of having understood in the 15 minutes of silence that the ground was real and that she was standing on it. She had sat next to an old woman and not spoken, and the old woman had not spoken, and then the old woman had stood up and left. That was, from the outside, the whole of it. From the inside, it was the specific confirmation that the voice about to walk onto the Newport stage was connected to everything that had produced the voice, to Port Arthur and the blues records and Bessie Smith, and the tradition that ran underneath all of it like a current, deep and continuous and real. She walked onto the stage. The festival crowd received what she gave with the quality of attention she had come to expect and never taken for granted, the specific attention of a large audience that has decided it is in the presence of something real. The quality of attention that said, "We are here, we are listening, give us what you have." She gave it. She gave it from the ground, from the line, from the specific weight of 15 minutes in a folding chair beside a woman she had never met and would not meet again, who had stood up and walked away without looking back, carrying whatever she carried, going wherever she was going, leaving behind her the specific presence that had been enough. It had been enough. It was always enough. The tradition passed the way it passed, not through documents or recordings or the official channels of cultural transmission, but through proximity, through presence, through the specific thing that cannot be named but can be felt, that does not require language because language is not its vehicle. She had felt it. She had carried it onto the stage. And the festival crowd, which had come for the music and received the music, received also, without knowing it, the 15 minutes in the folding chairs, the woman in the dress the color of good soil, the cloth bag on the ground, the hands in the lap, and the silence that had passed between two women who did not need to speak to say the thing that needed to be said. That night at Newport in July 1969, the tradition spoke through her with a clarity that made people describe the performance with a word they had not used for her before. Settled. She was settled. She had found the ground. And from the ground, the voice went where it needed to go, all the way, without apology, connected to everything that had made it what it was, carrying the line forward. One more performance, one more night, one more crowd in one more city, in the continuous unbroken work of giving the music what the music required. The woman in the dress the color of good soil walked somewhere in the festival grounds. Janis Joplin sang. The tradition continued.